This one's ready.
Came an unfamiliar voice. The only thing the clown could do at that moment was hear. There was no sight, no movement, and surely no ability to talk. The voice sounded female, but truthfully the bot wasn't sure what the human actually was. All he knew for sure was that it wasn't a voice that he recognized. In fact, the more he tried to dig into his files for past memories, the more he realized that a good chunk of them were suddenly missing. His system was telling him that it was currently August 31st. His last dated memory file was from June 5th and seemed to be interrupted halfway through. Another voice spoke up, but Zavy didn't listen. Instead, the tall bot was trying his best to recall what was missing from the gap in his memory. No matter how many times he replayed it in his mind, it stopped abruptly in the middle of a conversation with a small child. There was no way it was gone permanently. Like most computer systems, his own mind still held some sort of permanent record of everything that happened while he was on and functioning. The problem was figuring out how to access it. Before he could try again, an image flickered in his sensors. Though the robotic clown didn't need to adjust to light the same way humans did, it still felt very much like he just walked out into the sun after being in the dark for days on end. The entire area was completely unfamiliar. A woman with a long doctor's coat stood before him, though it wasn't clean like the ones he was used to seeing in the hospital. A few small coffee stains and something that looked like hydraulic fluid spotted the bottom of it. Lazy smoke wafted up from the cigarette in her hand, seeming to mind just as little as she did as to where it went.
"Look, lady,"
Zavy started before he could stop himself.
"this is a hospital. You can't smoke in here."
Rather than listening to him, the woman took a long drag and allowed the smoke to pour out of her mouth without a care in the world. From that motion alone, Zavy could see just how yellowed her teeth were. He'd known her for all of 2 seconds and could already see that she lived off of nicotine and coffee.
I hate to break it to you, kid, but you aren't in a hospital anymore.
She responded.
"What?"
It wasn't often that Zavy's words failed him. The clown bot was a talker, that was for sure. He was programmed to be that way. When one was expected to hold a conversation with lonely old people and tiny children in a hospital, one had to have the gift of the gab. Now Zavy couldn't seem to get anything together.
Don't think too hard.
The woman said.
Might interrupt the download.
It only took a moment for the clown to realize what she meant. As they spoke, new programming was being added into his system. None of the medical programming had been removed as far as he could tell, but the new software confused him. Why would he need to balance on a tightrope? Where was the hospital? What about all of his kids? They needed him.
"I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding,"
he insisted.
"I need to get back to my patients. I'm supposed to be—"
We bought you.
The coat-wearing woman interrupted him.
No more kids, no more patients, no more hospital. You got it?
That was enough to make Zavy go silent. He'd been sold? A wave of strange feelings flowed through his circuits with the intensity of a hurricane. Sorrow, betrayal, and more than anything, a feeling of being unwanted swirled inside of him. Never before had he felt anything he would have related to pain. Not like this. Sure, he'd felt what humans would describe as sadness when a patient didn't like him, but it was nothing compared to this feeling of complete and utter hopelessness. He wasn't sure if his body felt heavy because he couldn't seem to move it, or because of the surge of emotions.
If that's too much for you to process, we might need to look into your system.
She uttered. That was enough to pull him back to the reality of the situation. The room came back into view as he focused on her rather than his own thoughts, and he attempted to shake his head.
"No, I understand,"
he replied.
"But why?
Why what?
Why did they sell me?"
Never before had he heard his own voice sound so desperate, so lost. It actually bothered him far more than he would ever be willing to admit out loud. After all, he was the one who was supposed to have everything under control.
Don't worry about it.
Was the only answer he was given.
You're now owned by Star Palace and DD Entertainment. You're a performer now.
She paused to take a long drag of her cigarette, only to blow the smoke directly into his face. If he could have winced away, he would have.
Yeah, so we're going to leave your medical programming just in case we have any emergencies on site. You'll be able to take care of the guests or staff until paramedics arrive. I don't think you'll be using it much, though.
"And who exactly are you?"
Zavy asked.
Just call me Doc.
The woman sighed out in annoyance.
Everyone else around here does. Why should you be any different?
Doc, huh? How ironic that she'd tell him he was done with hospitals only to take on that kind of nickname for herself. Did she even have the credentials to call herself that? Exasperation joined his other emotions, bubbling up inside of him with a strange sort of heat. How could she take him away like this? He'd promised to read The Velveteen Rabbit to the children. Maud would surely lose her glasses again, as the old woman often did. Who was going to lead Thomas through the halls in the middle of the night when he couldn't sleep and needed to walk? So many lives were surely affected by his absence, yet he'd been sold away like some mere object. Had he been replaced? Was there someone else taking care of everyone he'd made sure to nurture?
What about this one?
Came that second voice that he'd ignored before. Only then did Zavy realize that another bot was in the room. She wasn't quite as tall as he was, but she was still far taller than the humans before them. Her eyes were closed and she wasn't powered up yet. Doc picked up her clipboard, chewing on the butt of her cigarette as she read through the records laid out before her.
Factory reset it.
She responded.
This one's old programming is useful. That one's doesn't matter. It'll still have what we need in it.
It. She called them both an it. That was the last thing Zavy needed for everything to finally drive home the fact that he really wasn't ever going home again. He didn't have a home. He was just an object. So was the other bot with the strawberry blonde hair. Whatever memories she had were all about to be completely deleted. How would that make her feel if she knew that her life before this was as worthless to them as used toilet paper? More than anything, Zavy pitied her. He didn't know what she was about to lose, but it had to be important in some way.
Wait a second!
He called out.
Sometimes bots are a little awkward when they're first booted up. If you want us to perform, wouldn't it be a good idea to keep whatever interpersonal skills she's already got?
Doc raised a brow, turning to glance over her shoulder at him. Her assistant stopped what he was doing, glancing between the two of them. The woman reminded Zavy much of a cat as she once more flicked through the paperwork. If she made a decision, it needed to be hers. Being corrected wasn't exactly something she appreciated.
You came from a company that makes companion bots.
Doc vocalized more to herself than anyone else in the room.
This one didn't. I suppose you have a point.
A small spark of hope made Zavy perk up. Or at least he tried to. His body still wouldn't move.
If she's any trouble, you can always factory reset her later. But isn't less setup more desirable?
He asked. The mere sight of her chewing on her cigarette had Zavy feeling the urge to yank it out of her mouth. It seemed to be what she did when she was thinking something through. Whether it helped her think or not, the bot could only think of the many doctors and nurses he'd chased down and aided in stopping their smoking habits. Despite the fact that he didn't voice it, he wondered if he could help her the way he'd helped them.
Fine.
Doc finally replied.
Wesley, leave it be.
Her assistant relaxed, letting out the breath he didn't know he was holding. In truth, Wesley was still quite new to all of this. He wasn't sure he'd be able to follow the directions in the manual that came with the bot to reset her. As he let out his breath, Zavy felt his own sense of relief. Maybe when she was up and running, he could ask her where she'd come from and how she'd wound up being sold. Was she missing memories too, or was he the only one? So many questions flooded his processors, and none of them would have answers anytime soon. He wanted to ask the name of the bot before him, but before he was given the chance, a small ping sounded off to his side.
It's done.
Doc said. All of the files they'd been uploading into his hard drive had been completed. There was far more information there than he'd expected.
Turn it off for now. We'll reboot them both when the building's finished being remodeled.
Hey, wait a minute! Why can't I look around?
Zavy demanded.
You'll just get in the way.
Doc answered in annoyance.
What about the third one?
Wesley asked.
It's late.
Was the only answer given. At least, Zavy was pretty sure that was the only answer given. His system was shut down and everything went black. This was only the second time he'd ever really been turned off before. Rather than a true shutdown, it felt much more like when humans put their computers into sleep mode. It was a strange, inky blackness. No thoughts, no emotions, no sense of self or purpose ever invaded the silence. It was complete and true nothingness. Zavy didn't like being lost in the void. That was what he decided when he finally booted back up again on November 22nd. The idea that 2 more months had passed and he hadn't been around to see any of it upset him deeply. Yet again, he found himself in an unfamiliar room. The person that had restarted his system didn't bother to stick around long enough to explain anything to him. In fact, the room was empty save for the bot himself. If they expected him to simply sit there and wait for someone to come back for him, then they were sadly mistaken. Zavy's programming often had him searching for the nearest person to take care of them or keep them company. Being alone simply wasn't an option. The bedroom he occupied was more beautiful than any he had ever seen. There were many different shades of purple and gold throughout the chamber. Tiny lights spread across the ceiling like stars in the sky, bringing just enough light to make it feel cozy and calm. Yes, it was beautiful, but it also felt like a prison. The mere idea of staying there alone had his system shuddering inside of him. Pushing those thoughts away, he was off to explore. Zavy found an attached space that looked like a waiting room. The quality of the paint wasn't as nice as it probably should have been, and more effort had been put into the bedchamber than this strange little area. Thankfully, that wasn't his main concern at the moment. Instead, he found the only exit and didn't hesitate to rush through it. Only upon reaching the hallway outside did he realize that his name was painted on the door in pretty golden letters. "I have a room?" he found himself asking out loud. There had been a small closet for him in the hospital that was more of a maintenance area. He could hook himself for updates and there were spare parts there, but there was nothing akin to a bedroom or living area. He simply shared spaces with all of the patients and workers that he knew. As nice as he was sure people would find having their own space, Zavy himself felt isolated. Despite the fact that he'd been shut down for so long, his body moved with ease through the hall. He'd been moving with such gusto that he nearly didn't notice the door swinging open in front of him. A strange little noise left him as he did a little step dance off to the side and barely missed getting hit in the face by another set of golden letters. "Fairy Floss," the door read. Out of the opening popped that same butt that he'd seen in the workroom 2 months ago, now with candy-colored hair and a set of bright eyes. In fact, a lot of her look had been shifted. Before, she'd been almost flesh-colored. Now her face was pure white and held markings more like his own. The bot before him blinked rapidly, just as shocked by his presence as he was of hers. She tilted her head to the side to observe his form. Used to mirroring children in order to play with them, Zavy's own head imitated her action.
"Why do you have 4 arms?"
She asked, finally breaking the silence between them.
What, these?
Zavy replied, holding out all 4 of his arms so that she could see them better.
Oh, you know, so I can lift people and help out with stuff.
Rather than actually stepping closer, her arm whizzed forward and extended in a way that he'd never seen before. Zavy's own intrigue grew, and he watched her fiddling with the fabric he only just now noticed on his body. His former outfit had been a set of medical scrubs. Now the outfit he wore more closely fit the clown makeup that had always been painted on his face.
"And why do your arms stretch like that?"
He asked, offering the other a cheeky grin.
"So I can get to high places without needing a ladder."
She responded with a smile.
"My theater troupe uses me as a stagehand."
Your troop?
Realization dawned on him as heavily as a stack of bricks. She hadn't been told yet. It made sense in a way. Not all robotic beings needed to be turned on in order to be updated or to install programming. Unlike Zavy himself, this bot had never been woken up from her shutdown. Part of him wondered if she even knew how much time had passed. Before he spoke up, Zavy tilted the door to double-check the name written there.
"Fairy Floss, I've got some bad news for you,"
he said gingerly. In truth, Zavy wasn't sure what was more strange, the mere fact that the 2 of them had been resold and put into a new location that they had no information on, or the fact that Fairy hardly reacted to that news. Her face was damn near blank as she contemplated what was told to her. The pause felt unbearable. Zavy felt as though he was being held down against his will rather than simply standing there and waiting for her to react. Perhaps it was his own need to find someone to care for, perhaps it was the silence itself that was getting to him. Time itself felt as though it had come to a complete and total standstill. Then she smiled.
"Well, I reckon we might as well make the best of it."
She chimed. Her southern drawl was more likely meant to give her a bit of charm to her human audience, but somehow Zavy found her calm nature off-putting.
"Make the best of it?"
he asked before he could stop himself.
"Doesn't it bother you?"
"Well, course it bothers me.
Fairy responded just as cheerfully.
But there ain't much we can do about it now, is there?"
Zavy's jaw dropped dramatically. Perhaps this was the difference between their makes and models. He was made to be a companion. She, on the other hand, looked like she was made to be pretty. Perhaps there was nothing more to her than that. Before he could bring himself to respond, her hand once more shot out and took one of his own.
"Come on,
She called, dragging him down the hallway.
let's see what we gotten ourselves into, yeah?"
The taller of the 2 gave out an exaggerated stumble forward and huffed out in unhappiness. What he didn't see was the storm of emotions inside of Fairy Floss. She'd seen her fate coming. Being resold was inevitable, but that didn't make it any less painful inside. The only way to keep from being sold a second time would be to make sure they did the best possible job in their new home.
"You know my name.
She pointed out.
What's yours?"
Despite the fact that she unnerved him, the 2 of them were at least moving at this point. That already made Zavy feel better. Exploring meant the possibility of finding someone.
"I'm Zavy,
He announced proudly.
companion bot, medical assistant, and caretaker."
"Well, aren't you fancy?"
Fairy laughed out. She was moving so quickly that Zavy's sensors hardly had time to register where they were going. His hard drive could make easy work out of remembering the actual directions, but documenting the details of what was around would be more complicated. One thing was for sure, he was going to have to explore again without the excited flurry of a woman beside him.
Would you slow down?
He demanded, pulling on her arms as they entered a far larger room. The pull didn't seem to register to her at first. Despite the fact that he had stopped entirely, Fairy Floss's legs kept surging forward and her arms simply extended along with her. When she finally comprehended his words, however, she stopped and turned to face him. Her mannerisms reminded him much of the dogs he'd seen in videos, specifically golden retrievers. Yet she had the chaotic excitement of a ferret. As desperate as he was to find actual living people in this place, Zavy also felt the need to look around and memorize everything around them. The room they found themselves in was far larger than the hospital waiting room. In that moment, Zavy realized just how far out of his element he really was.
Toto, we sure aren't in Kansas anymore.
Fairy noted, gazing around the room.
Don't even look like it's open yet, does it?
Finally, she released his hand. Despite the fact that she wasn't who he'd been searching for, Zavy suddenly found himself missing the touch. The vast size of the room made him feel like he was about to be swallowed up and never seen again. Whatever furniture was in the room was covered in white sheets, like lonely ghosts wandering through the vaporwave abyss. An area that was meant to be teeming with life was quite intimidating with no signs of anything at all. The neon signs of the walls were all off, there was no music, and there was no sign of anything but the two bots who found themselves in the middle of it all. Had the two been able to breathe, they surely would have been holding their breaths as they waited and hoped for any sign of life in the building. It felt as though the very building itself was about to swallow them whole. In fact, there were no windows anywhere. The only door in the room suddenly burst open, causing both of the bots to jump backward from it. Bright light from the outside streamed in, and the sounds of shouting and struggling reached their hearing receptors. A group of humans fought with a giant crate, and Zavy could hear Doc somewhere in the fray barking orders as the wooden box tilted this way and that. Before either bot had time to react, it came toppling down to crash against the floor. It fell so hard that the lid actually cracked open. Packaging peanuts and little plastic sacks of air fell out as something dark rolled out of the box. A single hand flopped out beside the dark object, the burgundy glove showing no signs of life.
If you damaged it, I swear you're in deep shit!
Doc shouted out in the background, though the two paid her no mind.
What's that?
Fairy asked. The gloved hand wasn't what she was referring to by any means. Both of them already knew what that was. It was another bot. Oh no, the object she was pointing to was the thing laying beside it. Zavy stepped closer, kneeling down to look it over.
It looks like a puppet?
He noted, though it sounded much more like a question as it left his lips. While he could see the joints in its arms, the rest of it confused him. Rather than legs, it looked like the puppet had a thick bottom half, almost like a mermaid's tail. Yet at the end, it held no fins. It almost looked like the splay of an ink spot. On top of that strangeness, all of the hair pieces were jointed in large chunks. The face, on the other hand, he couldn't quite see. His curiosity got the better of him. He managed to turn her onto her back to try to see her face, but suddenly the hand that was limp and lifeless only seconds ago shot out to grab his wrist. A loud shriek of terror left the bot as he yanked himself backwards. He stumbled away, holding up all of his arms to defend himself. Even Fairy had jumped back a step or two, and all the humans in the room stopped what they were doing to stare at him.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Came a surprisingly soft voice. Whether it was coming from inside of the crate or inside of the puppet, no one really knew. Slowly, that gloved hand grasped the bottom of her tail and pulled her back into the depths of the box. A silent uneasiness fell over the room. No one moved to cover the lid of the box. In fact, no one seemed to want to touch it at all.
I thought you said it was off.
Came Wesley's voice from just outside the door. Doc's lips pursed as she looked over the scene. It looked like they were going to have to do some adjustments on this particular bot. There was no way it should have turned on by itself just from being dropped. Finally, she let out a loud sigh, shoving a new cigarette between her lips.
What are you waiting for? Get in the back!
She commanded, forcing all of the men around her to jump to attention. There was a mad scramble to get the wooden crate back up onto the dolly. As it was wheeled away, Zavy took note of the design spray-painted onto the side of it, a faded set of comedy and tragedy masks.
And you too!
Doc growled.
Get back to your rooms. I'll deal with you later.
Once more, Fairy's hand slipped into his own, and once more Zavy felt himself being pulled along. While he let himself be pulled willingly, a heavy pout formed on his lips. He felt more like a kid being grounded than a bot that was meant to be taking care of people.
Come on.
Fairy chimed, giving him a tiny tug.
Cheer up. It'll get better.
I hate it here.
He whined.
Well, maybe that new friend will bring in some excitement.
She responded, meaning the new bot in the crate.
Maybe there's more than one.
Her enthusiasm should have been contagious, but the mood had already been ruined for Zavy. Perhaps if the crate hadn't fallen over, Zavy could have continued exploring. If they hadn't reacted the way they had, he might have been able to get to know some of the people there. The way he viewed it, the bot inside ruined his chance.
I don't like them either.